Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the Klishchiivka direction in the southern flank of Bakhmut, where the Russians managed to capture the forest line here in the northern parts of Klishchiivka. This allows them to get closer to the Ukrainian positions in the forest line and patch here to the north of Klishchiivka, which is one of the main defensives and main targets of the Russians here in the northern parts. If the Russians continue their pressure and manage to advance and capture the forest patch, they'll be able to start pushing in the northern and western direction and threaten the Ukrainian positions here by Klishchiivka. Meanwhile, fighting continues in the fortified zone here to the north of Klishchiivka, where the Russians are trying to push into the forest patch to the south of the fortified zone. And positional fighting continues here in the east of Klishchiivka, as well as to the south of Avdiivka and in the north of Pervomaiske, as the Russians managed to make some small advances at the start of the month and year. We move on to the direction of Avdiivka, where we see that the Russians made two advancements here, both in the fields to the northeast of Avdiivka and a small advance in the Dacia area, which is revealed by this geolocated footage we have of the Avdiivka direction. Fighting here continues as the Russians attempt to improve their positions here to the northeast of Avdiivka to threaten the Ukrainian positions within the city and to widen out the areas in which they have to protect against Russian advances. They're currently fighting here in the northern parts as well as in the southern parts in the direction of the southeast by the industrial zone, and with that the Russians are trying to pressure the Ukrainians here in the northeast to relieve some pressure on the northern axis, where the Ukrainians have managed to push the Russians back a bit. Most of the fighting here has slowed down significantly due to the weather conditions, where there's been a lot of snow and there's been a significant drop in temperature. This makes it very difficult for both sides to adapt, and the amount of artillery being launched by both sides had also significantly decreased. This on top of the fact that yesterday was the 7th of January, which is the Orthodox Christmas. So there's been some sort of unofficial truce where neither side really shelled too much against the other over the past day or so. And with that, we see that there's been a sort of a break throughout the front line, although there's been these territorial changes. We then move in the direction of Pervomaiske, where the Russians managed to capture this part of the southern parts of Pervomaiske. The main reason for this is their recent advance here in the northern parts, which made the Ukrainians withdraw slightly from these southern positions. However, there was enough for the Russians to then take advantage of that to capture these positions in the edge of the front here in the Pervomaiske direction. So with this, we see increased Russian pressure in the Pervomaiske direction, as the Russian advances here in the north by Vodiane has been significantly longer than what in the direction of Pervomaiske. And with that, we see that the Russians will likely try to push here in the central parts to threaten the Nevelske direction, similar to the Marinka direction, where they, instead of pushing towards Pobieda, they instead focused on gaining full control over Marinka. And a similar thing has happened here in Pervomaiske, where instead of pushing towards Nevelske, they're now focusing in the direction of Pervomaiske. And if they manage to gain full control over Pervomaiske, then they can then threaten Nevelske from multiple directions, both from the north, east, and from the south. In the Marinka direction here to the south of Pervomaiske, there's been two geolocated pieces of footage. The first one here in the western parts of the central part of Avdiivka. The Ukrainian positions here have been shelled by Russian forces, which shows that their offensive operations here in the Avdiivka direction continues with the recent ongoing fighting in this direction. We also see geolocated footage from the recently captured parts here to the south of the church area in the Avdiivka direction. So with that, we see that the advances reported by Syriac maps have been confirmed by these geolocated images, and as such we see that there's continuous pressure by the Russians here in the Marinka Avdiivka direction as well. So there is continuous fighting in the Donetsk region mainly. We then move on to the Novomikhailivka direction, where the Ukrainians managed to recapture the outskirts of the village, as is shown by this geolocated footage, where we see Russian positions at the very outskirts of the southern parts of Avdiivka being hit by Ukrainian FPV drones. And after this, it was reported that the Russians were pushed out and had to retreat out of the foothold from the south of Avdiivka, and fighting continues on the outskirts to the east, but the Russians had lost their foothold to the south. Moving back in a northern direction, we also see some Ukrainian movement here in the Zaporizhzhia direction, where the Ukrainians here managed to regain some of the lost positions by the road to the Zaporizhzhia, as is seen with this geolocated footage here, which shows Ukrainians looking at some Russian vehicles which were abandoned by the Russians after their last offensive operation here to the west of the Zaporizhzhia, which allowed them to regain this territory here west of the Zaporizhzhia. So we're seeing continuous positional fighting here west of the Zaporizhzhia, on top of the fighting in direction of Terny and the Zaporizhzhia first area, where the Russians have managed to advance in both of these directions. So there's continuous positional fighting all throughout the front line, but no signs of any bigger offensive yet so far. We also have some geolocated footage to the west of Zaporizhzhia, where a Ukrainian tank entered the gray zone between Zaporizhzhia and Ukrainian positions, and this geolocated footage shows the Russians shelling the Ukrainian tank and getting it out of commission, as the Ukrainians continuously attempt to pressure the Russian forces in this direction, as they have managed to advance south of it. So advancing and putting some positions here to the north of it would pressure the Russians in the midst of their advances. So we're seeing continuous positional fighting as both sides continue to attempt to improve their positions and to weaken their opponent's positions. With all of this in mind, there's been some interesting information and statistics being released, where a American newspaper reports that the Russians throughout the Ukrainian summer offensive launched approximately 5,000 shells a day, while the Ukrainians launched about 7,000 a day, while the Ukrainians currently launch about 2,000 shells a day compared to the Russians launching 10,000 shells a day. So the Ukrainians had a slight advantage, about 1.4 to 1 throughout the summer, and the Russians now have a 5 to 1 advantage in the amount of shells being used per day. So with this, we see that the Ukrainian positions are heavily pressured right now, and they're barely holding on when it comes to the artillery fights, as Russians has this significant advantage. And the only reason the Ukrainians were able to launch 7,000 shells a day throughout the month of the Ukrainian summer offensive. At the same time, we also see the fact that the Russians only launched 5,000 and are now launching 10,000, despite the amount that they are producing. This means that the Russians currently produce as much as they expend, and this also means that throughout the summer offensive of the Ukrainians, the Russians were actually having some artillery shells in reserve. They were producing more than they were using through those months, and now they're producing as much as they are using. And at the same time, there was the deal with North Korea, and this came at the same time as the Ukrainians actually launched a deal with South Korea. So the South Koreans actually sent a lot of 155mm shells to Ukraine. This was confirmed by American media, and this shows that the Ukrainians had this build-up where the South Koreans actually sent more shells in total than what all of the EU countries did in total. So the South Koreans sent a significant deal, and this was most likely what was used in the Ukrainian summer offensive. This means it is also difficult for them to recreate such a scenario where they can use more than the Russians. And at the same time, the Russians saw the Ukrainian summer offensive as small a threat that they could save up their own ammunition for their own offensive, which we now expect, especially with the deal with the North Koreans. The Russians have saved a lot up. At the very least, even if they hadn't done the deal with the North Koreans, then they should have enough to spend 3 through 6 months of 15,000 shells a day compared to the 10,000 they use right now, and that would be in comparison to Ukrainian 2,000 a day. And that is going to be all for this analysis and video. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.